Dan Hannan, who is, of course, the Conservative MEP and Brexiteer from the southeast of England, and Richard Corbett, who is a Remainer for Labour for Yorkshire and the Humber. Dan, good to see you. Thank you for being with us. Just after the election, David Davis said what we need is more discussion with our partners in the House of Commons. There needs to be perhaps more compromise, and yet today what he set out, we're leaving the customs union and we're leaving the single market. Where's the compromise in that?
Well, it flows from leaving the European Union that you leave the jurisdiction of the EU institutions. So that isn't something that there was ever going to be any compromise possible on. Where there could be compromise is on whether, having left and taken back control legally, you then replicate some of the contents of the single market. So, for example, I think the real basis of the single market is the rule that says that you can't discriminate against the goods or products of another member country. Now, I didn't come across anyone in the referendum in the UK who was against doing that. So it may well be that through our domestic law and through bilateral treaties, we can copy some of those rules so that you keep, if you like, the substance of quite a lot of the single market, the way that, say, the Swiss do, while being outside the jurisdiction of the European Court and the European Commission.
The frustration, Richard, for many Remainers in the UK is that there really isn't an alternative, because although Labour talks about a softening of position, if you're upholding freedom of movement, you're leaving the single market. If you want to negotiate your own trade deals, you're leaving the customs union. And that seems to be where Jeremy Corbyn is.
Well, if we leave the single market and the customs union, there is a great danger to the British economy. So I'm very surprised that after all the talk after the general election of that so-called hard Brexit option, the economically damaging option, being reviewed, since it wasn't endorsed by the electorate, and there was all this talk about a wider, more moderate approach, reaching out to people with different views. Today, David Davis nonetheless said we stick to the white paper which surely is largely discredited after the events of the last few weeks.
When it comes to the customs union, if you're leaving the customs union, how do you have this, what David Davis called an invisible border between north and south in Ireland?
Well, no other free trade area in the world, with the exception of Vladimir Putin's Eurasian Union and one other, is a customs union. And the normal free trade thing is that you're not obliged to have a single external tariff. Now, leaving the customs union means that Britain can now sign free trade agreements with America and India and Australia and China, all of the big growing economies overseas, which to a single approximation are going to account for 100% of the growth in this century. So staying in the customs union while leaving the EU really would be the worst of all worlds, because it would mean that Brussels continued to control all of our trade policy without us having any say over it.
It is a tricky balance for the Conservative government, this, isn't it? Because they had to come here today looking in charge of their brief, knowing what they wanted, and yet the politics at home tells you that there's an awful lot of discussion to be had in the House of Commons.
Indeed, and I don't think there's necessarily a majority in the House of Commons for leaving the customs union, because if you leave the customs union, it's not quite so easy as Dan portrays. Not only are you outside your main export market in terms of exporting to it, you also need to make new agreements, as Dan said, with the rest of the world to replace the agreements that we currently have via the European Union. Many of those were negotiated with the leverage, the clout of the world's largest market. We got concessions from other countries that way. If we come along just as Britain saying, could we have the same please? There's no guarantee we're going to get as good a deal.
The trouble is, I put this to both of you, the halfway house is pretty unsatisfactory. Do we have a Norway deal where we pay a lot of money in and we have no clout?
Well, the Swiss have, if you like, a customs border, although if you drive from France to Switzerland, you barely notice the customs border. All they're really looking for is your tax disc on your car to make sure you paid the road tax. The Swiss export nearly 5 times as much per head to the EU as we do. The Norwegians more than twice as much. So plainly, this is not a block to export. But what it means is that those countries, for example, have free trade agreements with China. China is the second biggest economy in the world. The US is the biggest economy in the world. The EU doesn't have trade agreements with either of those two giants. Britain now will have, and I'll offer Richard £1 to €1 that we will have trade deals with those two long before the EU does.
The Swiss agreement with China doesn't even give the Swiss the right to export their watches duty-free to China. It's a pretty bad agreement, frankly.
It does over time.
Through Europe, we get better trade deals because we have the clout of the single market. If we're leaving the customs union, we're at great peril of not replicating, let alone bettering those agreements.
Just very quickly, is soft Brexit dead?
Soft Brexit, I think, is still alive. It does have the disadvantage of leaving still the European Union, because you have to then accept the rules that you don't have a say on anymore. It would be far better to stay and be able to shape those rules, but economically it's a far less damaging option.
We want the closest possible relationship with our European allies compatible with being an independent country. That means keeping our trade deals, it means keeping our military and security links. It means being the best of neighbours. We want to have prosperous neighbours because they make good customers. So the last thing we want...
member.
Well, no, we will be, if you like, a kind of a country club member, supporting it from the outside without being part of the political union. In other words, we'll get what the British people always wanted, which is a common market, not a common government.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.